Hi. There was no doubt in Columbus's day that the earth was a sphere, contrary to what for several generations they tried to teach that Columbus was the only one of his day who believed the earth was round. They all did. The Portuguese knew that China could be reached by sailing west, but they also said that, 10,000-mile journey, we'd all die of thirst or starvation before we got there. There's just not enough room on a ship to carry that much food and supplies and cargoes, so they never attempted it. Now, again, folk, Columbus is controversial. There have been persons who have said that they know or believe that Columbus had a map of the world that had been given to him by Prince Henry, his adopted father-in-law. And this map showed the North and South American continents, showed the Amazon River, showed the Mississippi River, and showed Antarctica, which wasn't discovered till the early 1800s. Even showed the river. Antarctica is the only continent in the world where a river runs from one side of it to another. Antarctica basically is split in two by a river running. We didn't know that until recently. Antarctica is under 3 miles of ice. But anyway, the King of Portugal would not finance his plan, and again, I'd like for someone to explain to me how that a man who grew up as a pauper could marry into royalty and could stand before kings and requisition 3 ships. I mean, something doesn't add up there. I have heard that Columbus was actually a very wealthy man and grew up with a lot of wealth, but that's not the standard view. So it's again, if you're confused, so is everybody else. Now, Columbus had a 12-year-old boy at the helm of his big ship, the Santa Maria, and this 12-year-old boy went around where two seas meet, going around the island of Hispaniola, and the current was too much for him. Basically, 2 seas meet. The current was too much for him, and he grounded the ship and dashed it to pieces. So Columbus had to leave several of his men. So he built a fort for his men he left behind. He carried 7 Indians with him, whom he called Tainos, T-A-I-N-O-S. Columbus left some Spaniards behind, took 7 Tainos with him. Well, when he got there, he showed off the gold he had found and showed off the Tainos, or the Indians he found. He got a lot of people in the court interested. So Columbus was honored. He was given a fleet of 17 ships this time. And there he learned that the Tainos, or something, had killed off all the Europeans he had left behind. Now, folk, I want to remind you, Columbus did not carry the best of Europeans with him. The men he carried with him were jailbirds, mostly, whom the Queen had promised freedom if they went with him. They were criminals, not at all the best of people. Some people believe that the white men, the Europeans, might have provoked what happened to them, and there's a possibility that happened, but there is a language barrier. In other words, Columbus did not understand the language of the Indians. They did not understand Spanish. So, what actually happened when the Europeans found out that their fellow Europeans had been killed, this led to the start of war that was to last for some 400 years. Columbus altogether made 4 voyages to the New World. He went to South America. He never came to what is today the United States. Never came to Mexico. But he visited mostly the islands. He discovered the island of Jamaica, the island of Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and the Antilles. And he bumped into South America at one point, but never hit what is today the United States. Now, the standard view of history is that Columbus died without realizing he'd found a new world, and he died believing he was in the East Indies. That's why I called the people we met Indians. He believed they were Indies people, people from the Indies. And if you look on the globe of the world, you'll find there's the East Indies and the West Indies. The West Indies are over here, these islands right in, these are the West Indies. These islands right in here. The East Indies are over off the map, right over here. These islands right here. And when Columbus, he knew he was on an island, he believed he was in the East Indies. Well, a lot of people believe that Columbus had arrived in the Far East. Columbus lived about 12 years after his initial discovery. I believe he died in 1505, 1492, 13 years after his initial discovery. But for about a decade after that, people believed that he had arrived in the Far East. It was finally learned he had actually discovered new lands. The New World was not named after Columbus. The standard view is it was named after Amerigo Vespucci, who came to the Americas 5 years after Columbus's initial trip in 1497. Now, folks, this is controversial, if he came at all. But anyway, now, there is another point of view. I mean, hey, I'm sorry if I'm confusing you, but folks, it's the way history is. That actually the New World, the America, was called America for centuries before Columbus. The Knights Templar is known to have come to the Americas, and they told the King of Scotland, oh, we buried our treasure in the land of America across the Atlantic. And a lot of persons have spent a lot of their time looking for the Templar treasury, and we have found Templar artifacts in the Americas. In this morning's class, some students told me they had heard that. And we have found a Templar grave site also. Who were the Templars? They were a secret lodge, a secret order of knights who were highly persecuted in the old world, and some of them came to the new. Anyway, the word America is believed to have come from Amerigo Vespucci. All right. Some Americans continued to explore, some Europeans continued to explore. Balboa was told if you cross the mountains, there's an ocean. Eventually, when they learned, the Indians and Europeans learned how to talk to each other. Some Indians learned Spanish, some Europeans learned some Indian tongues. Some people, folk, have a knack for picking up on another language in a snap, and others of us don't. But anyway, Balboa, every time Balboa would get near a mountaintop, he'd tell this man, you wait here, I want to be the first person to see the ocean. He finally crossed the mountain, looked over, and there it was, calm and peaceful. I myself have seen the Pacific Ocean 2 times, and both times I have to say it looked calm and peaceful compared to the Atlantic, which is much more turbulent. At least when I saw it, it was, I'll put it that way. But anyway, he saw the Pacific, and he named it Pacific after the word peace. Balboa saw the Pacific Ocean, and that way Europeans knew that there was another large body of water that lay on the other side of the world that they had discovered. So, Ferdinand Magellan took it on himself to sail around the world. Magellan started out with some 300 men. 3 years later, 18 men made it back to Spain. It was said that the 18 men who made it back jumped off their ship, bowed down, and kissed the ground. I mean, a lot of soldiers returning from the war will do the same thing. But anyway, Magellan was killed in the Philippines. Magellan, let's see, let me go into a little bit more detail. He started out in Spain, over here. Started out in Spain, and then went to South America. And every time he'd come, he'd hope that South America would end. He got to here and thought, nope, that's not the end. Kept going. Eventually, he found a break in the land, This is what bears his name. It's called the Strait of Magellan. He went around it, and there was the peaceful Pacific Ocean. He knew he was very far south. He'd better get up north, so he took an angle. He wound up, he bumped into the Hawaiian Islands, discovered Hawaii, went on to cross the ocean to the Philippines, and there in the Philippines, he was killed. Right here, let's see. These are the Philippine Islands. He went from there on to some of these other places. Actually, he didn't go, his crew. And eventually, they knew that Africa had an end, so they headed for what they knew was the tip end of Africa. And then went up Africa, west coast of Africa, and back to Spain. The whole trip took 10 years. Took 3 years, probably the whole trip took 3 years. All right. Magellan's voyage, though, proved to everybody that Columbus had actually discovered a new land and had not gone to the Far East. Magellan, when he actually arrived in the East Indies, he knew for sure he was in the East Indies. Again, what I didn't mention, Europeans had invented navigation devices, the compass, the astrolabe. The astrolabe is the device you point to the sun and it tells you what angle you are on the earth, your latitude, how far you are above or below the equator. These devices help navigate, and of course, Europeans knew how to navigate by stars. Now, navigating by stars is tricky. North of the equator, you can always find the North Star and know where north is. South of the equator, you can't see the North Star, and there's no star directly below the South Pole. So navigation was a little bit more tricky, but Magellan, the Europeans had learned how to do it. The sky looks a lot different in the south of the equator than it does north, by the way. You can see a lot of stars there that you can't see in the northern hemisphere. All right. There began an exchange between the old world and new that continues to this day. From the old world came Christianity, sailing ships, firearms, wheels, horses, farm animals like pigs, cows, sheep, etc. Domesticated animals, the cat, and the American Indians somehow had the dog. Maybe they brought the dog with them for when they came across, but they had dogs. But smallpox and measles came along and they killed the Indians in droves. From the New World to the Old, the New World sent the Old World corn, potatoes, pineapples, tobacco, and syphilis. Well, at first, the New World was a disappointment to the Spanish. There was very little gold at first, or anything else that brought wealth. And the Spanish would enslave the Indians, but the Indians had an easy time getting away because they knew the territory and the Spanish didn't. Also, the Indians died rather quickly. They did not have any immunity to European diseases. But the year 1519 changed all this when Spain went on to become the richest nation in Europe for a short time. Not for long. Mexico. Cortez had helped the Spanish conquer Cuba. He had been on one of Columbus's voyages. He heard that there were rumors of a very wealthy kingdom in Mexico, just to the west of the Gulf of Mexico. So, he finally went to Mexico. What I don't mention in these notes was when he went to Mexico, he told his men to burn the ships. We're either going to conquer this place or we're going to die trying. We're not going to leave without conquering. So he was given a young woman as a gift from a Mayan chieftain. This woman was apparently very gifted. She could pick up on languages very fast. She learned the Spanish language really fast, and she served as interpreter because she knew several languages, including the Mayan, including the language of Montezuma. So she traveled with him. In fact, Cortez eventually married her. The Mexican emperor feared that Cortez was a god. His name was Montezuma. He feared he was a god, Quetzalcoatl, who was predicted to return. Now, again, this opens up a whole lot that I'm not going to take the time to go into, but if you know anything about Norse mythology, the Norse worshipped a god named Odin, and Odin was reported to have made many a trip across the Atlantic and back many a time. But that's somewhat of a different story, but we don't know if Odin was Quetzalcoatl or not. But there is supposedly a story among the Aztecs that one day a white god was going to return. And this would be bad news for the Mexica, or the Mexica is another way of saying Aztecs. The Spanish had cannon, they had horses. The Indians believed that the horseman was a beast, a special beast that had 2 heads and 6 legs. They believed horse and rider were one person. You keep in mind a horse and rider both were covered with iron armor or steel armor. And this made quite an impression on the Mexico also. Montezuma sent gifts, and among the gifts were human sacrifices, which the Spaniards did not appreciate in the least. But also Cortez, with the aid of his young partner, his young wife, was able to learn that the Indians that Montezuma had conquered were very, very discontented with Montezuma's rule. They told how that Montezuma's men would come in and as tax collectors and take their women, their wives and daughters, and take them away as sex slaves and take anything they wanted. And Cortez sensed the discontent among the conquered Indians. Eventually, Cortez and Montezuma met. Now, folk, here's a part of the story. I always ask this question. I'm going to ask in a minute. But anyway, basically, Cortez heard a bunch of hideous screams coming from the temple. He asked what these screams meant. He was told that these were the people being sacrificed to the sun god. Cortez turned to Montezuma and said, "Your gods are not gods but devils." Well, this created a few tense moments, but peacekeepers came in on both sides and temporarily smoothed things down. Now here's my question for you. If you had been there with Cortez and heard the screams, what would you have done? And if you don't know the answer, I don't either. I'll tell you what Cortez done. He used this as an excuse to put an end to this practice of human sacrifice and to put an end to Montezuma's rule. Cortez imprisoned Montezuma. The Mexico revolted against Cortez's rule. Cortez was forced to retreat. He went to a place where he knew he'd get the Indians who were hostile to Montezuma. They did help Cortez. Now, there are 4 reasons, folks, why Cortez won. Reason, I guess one of them was the fear factor. The Mexico were afraid of Cortez and his men. They were afraid of his cannon. They were afraid of his gunpowder. They were afraid of his horses. They also believed he was a god. Number 2 was all these, number 2, half of Montezuma's men wouldn't fight. Again, out of fear. Number 3 was the germ warfare that Cortez really did not start. The Spanish, without meaning to, spread their diseases among the Indians, particularly smallpox, measles, and typhus, which the Indians had never seen before and had no resistance to, no immunity to. And then the other reason was Cortez got tens of thousands of discontented Indians on his side. few years ago, I had a student turn in a paper on this, and he said that if you actually try to look at the whole thing objectively, it's really difficult to tell which side was more morally bankrupt than the other. Was Cortez morally bankrupt, or was Montezuma? And the fact is, it appears that both of them were so equally morally bankrupt, it's difficult to tell which one. Here's what Cortez did. After he had won, killed Montezuma, he then enslaved both sides, the Indians who had helped him and the Indians who had gone against him. More Spanish came in from the islands to assist Cortez in his rule, and they treated the Indians with utter disdain, friend and foe alike. All right. Anyway, the Spanish had finally found a rich group of Indians. Okay. So they began to search for more Mexicos. The only real Mexico they found, and the only other one was the Inca Empire in Peru. After Balboa had seen the Pacific Ocean, he died. His successor in the group, Pizarro went on to Peru and set up a town in Peru. Then when Pizarro noticed the Inca were a little bit weak after fighting a war, he moved in and conquered the Incas. However, the Inca chieftain promised that if you release me, I'll fill this room half full. The room was the size of a classroom. He said, I'll fill it with gold as far as I can reach. The Inca chieftain was a tall man. The Spanish took him up on the bargain. The Inca chieftain filled the room half full of gold. In other words, folks, this gold found its way into Europe, and it ended Europe's gold shortage. Europe had had a gold shortage since the days of the Roman Empire. In Roman times, the Romans would buy goods from China, and the Chinese would not buy them back. And an unfavorable balance of trade, well, also China and India both. An unfavorable balance of trade is making news right now in 2019, and it involves China. That's another story. I mean, folks, sometimes these events repeat themselves. Maybe you're aware that the United States is fighting a trade war with China right now. But anyway, we want a more equitable trade. Well, the Romans never achieved an equitable trade with China, so almost all of Europe's gold was lost. And for centuries, Europe operated without gold. But then we got all this gold from the Incas, and that alleviated the shortage. Now, Pizarro himself was killed by one of his own men later. Ponce de Leon. Ponce de Leon went to Florida, the first Spaniard to come to what is today the United States. He died doing so. Now, there are stories he was looking for a fountain of youth. We believed these stories for generations, but recent research has cast doubt on it that actually he knew better. But the story goes that he'd every time come to a pond, he would have his men step back and he'd drink from the pond, hoping that he would turn young again. Instead, he got older. But again, this is now believed to be myth. There is a street in Atlanta named Ponce de Leon. Okay, folks, I want to pause. I have picked up at least 9 students, more than I've lost, since Monday. So anyway, Sarah, this is roll call. Oops. I don't like for this to go out on